Today we will continue listening to God's story. What we have set out to do is to read the whole Bible. What's the first book of the Bible? Genesis. What's the last book of the Bible? Revelation. I remember when my son was a little younger, he thought that the title for the last book is Revolution. It's not. Revelation. From Genesis to Revelation is God's story. God is revealing something to us in each segment, in each chapter. So, what we have decided to do is to read the Bible, about 3 chapters a piece, and ask the question about the main message contained in that particular passage. So, today is our 24th installment. Today is sermon number 24. And dedicated to the book of Exodus specifically is sermon number 6. And the title is God's Story, 2 Murmurings. Could you try to repeat it? Murmurings. Doesn't it sound cool? No? What's a synonym? What's a murmuring? Grumbling, making fuss about, showing verbally your dislike of something. 2 Murmurings is the title for the sermon today, and we will be studying. Our portion for today is the book of Exodus, chapter 16, 17, and 18. And if you had a chance to read through those, it would help you to stay in the story and would help to get most of this sermon. So let me ask you a question at the beginning. Did you have those episodes? Is murmuring something that you occasionally do? Have you complained to God? Have you showed or verbalized your dissatisfaction with the people around you about something? What is God's reaction when we complain, when we murmur, when we grumble? What is His reaction to such? We will try to find the answer in today's story. And I would like to first look at some grumbling that had place when Israel was lacking water. That's the first murmuring. The second one is when they were lacking food. That's why the title for the sermon, 2 Murmurings, for water or in regards to water, and for food in regards to food. Our story begins at the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verse 22. Here's what it says. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. The location is given. What's the location? Shur. And it's the place where they were going to right after the incident at the Red Sea. And that's where God parted the water. So they were able to go through the sea by dry land. So God showed His power, God showed His miracles. And right after that, they set out to journey to the wilderness of Shur. A question for you. Has any one of you abstained from drinking any kind of liquid for 3 days? Have any one of you experienced what it means to not drink for 3 days? I haven't. None of you raising your hand either. So add to that the desert-like conditions, hot air, scarcity of resources. And they are marching, and they are marching. There is no place to find water. What would you feel? Would you begin to murmur? Here's what they did. The book of Exodus, chapter 15, verses 23 and 24. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Just imagine, you have been marching for 3 days, and finally there is a source of water. We could vividly imagine how the whole congregation, all those maybe 2 or 3 million of people, they ran toward the water, and they discovered that it is bitter. It's not potable. You cannot drink it. And when this happened, they began grumbling against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" But the fact that they were silent and being patient for 3 days prior to that shows a great deal about them. Obviously, they were so filled with enthusiasm after seeing what God did at the Red Sea that they persisted. And it gave them courage, it gave them assurance and this steadfastness to go on believing that the God who parted the water would again provide the water to drink. But after 3 days, their patience and enthusiasm ran out, which is quite understandable. And they began murmuring. Do you remember what was God's reaction? How does God react when people are murmuring? Let's read the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verse 25. And he, meaning Moses, cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So God performs a miracle. He changes the substance of the water. He changes, presumably, the formula of the water. And from being bitter and non-potable, it becomes drinkable. It becomes sweet. God performs a miracle. There is no even a slightest reproach. God is not rebuking his people. He simply performs a miracle to satisfy their thirst. That's the first episode about murmuring in context of not having water. Let's go to the next place. So the first place, for those who are working on sermon points, first place is Marah, right? Marah. The second place is, let's go to the book of Exodus, chapter 17, verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for people to drink. What's the name of the place? Rephidim. That's the second place. Rephidim. And the phrase mentioned in this verse is quite remarkable. Why did they get there? Whose idea was it for them to go to this place called Rephidim? What does the text say? You could just answer. It's right there on the screen. It says, according to the commandment of the Lord. There is this expectation that many Christians have, that if you are with God, if you dedicate yourself to Him, and if He is the one leading, then you will have all your bases covered. You won't have any problems in life at all, because after all, He is almighty. He is omniscient. He is loving. He is caring. And it's true. But there is this expectation that if God is leading, then everything should be without any problems. Everything should be provided. But here we have another instance. There is no water. And probably most unfortunate situation is this. The last time when water is mentioned in the text of Torah, in the text of Pentateuch, this is what it says. Exodus 15:27. 15:27. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water. Not just any kind of body of water, but springs. So the clearest, the tastiest water available. So there were these 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Presumably, they filled all their jugs, all the containers that they had. Obviously, some of them were made out of animal skins, and they packed, they got ready for the march. But they drank all the water, and now they don't have any. What do? Exodus chapter 17, verses 2 and 3 say, Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, Give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So they are murmuring, they are grumbling. And what do you think God would do? What would God say? What is God's reaction to murmuring? Let's read verses 5 and 6, chapter 17. And the Lord said to Moses, Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. What's God's reaction? Again, He performs a miracle. He takes out water, out of a rock. And again, as previously, there is no even a slightest reproach. He is not rebuking his people. He just patiently and supernaturally provides to satisfy their needs. So this is what the book of Exodus tells us about the water and murmuring in relation to it. That's the first murmur. What's the second? Food. Let's take a look at what happens in their journey according to the book of Exodus chapter 16, verse 1. It says, They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. So what's the location for those who work on your sermon points? The location is the wilderness of Sin. Pretty cool name, huh? It doesn't sound as well in other languages, like in Russian, right? So this is the location. What's the time? When did it happen? It says, you could see it on the screen, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Do you remember? Do you happen to remember what was the date of their departure? On the night of the 14th. was the sacrifice of the lamb, and they departed the next day. So 1 month has passed. 1 month. Presumably, they took some food for them. Though they were living in haste, still some of them must have had some resources, because up to this point, the Bible never mentions anything about them complaining in regards to food. But now all their resources have been used up. All the food was eaten. There is nothing. And what do? The book of Exodus, chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled or murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." People want food. Specifically, what do they mention? Meat and bread. So what do you think God's reaction is? A month after they went out of the land of Egypt, when all the supplies have been depleted and have been eaten, they are complaining. What does the Lord do? Chapter 16, verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven to you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." Then verses 11 through 15. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' In the original, Manna. For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, 'It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat.'" So again, there is murmuring. What's God's reaction? He doesn't rebuke. He doesn't reproach. He again creates something. He performs a miracle. And they have meat and they have bread as they wanted. We see the same pattern. God simply provides what is a necessity for his people. So this is what we have in terms of two murmurings in the book of Exodus. Murmuring about water, murmuring about food. But it's interesting to note that when you continue reading the biblical account and you arrive to the book of Numbers, there are again murmurings about the same things, again about water, again about bread. Let's take a look at how God is reacting later in the story. First, about water. The book of Numbers, chapter 20, verse 1. And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. So the place is given, it's a wilderness of Zin, Z-I-N. And what's the time? Do you see it? When did it take place? It says in came in the first month, right? Do you see it on the screen? In the first month. But which year? When did it happen? When you compare this passage with the book of Numbers, chapter 33, where there are all the encampments of the children of Israel listed in sequence, we find the following, chapter 33, verses 36 through 38. And they set out from Ezion Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. So the same story has been related again. And they set out from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor on the edge of the land of Edom. And Aaron the priest went up Mount Hor at the command of the Lord and died there in the 40th year after the people of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, on the first day of the 5th month. So when was it? It was on the 40th year. On the first month, Miriam died. On the 5th month, Aaron died. So there is this 40-year span between the incident that we read about when God provided water out of a rock, and then Miriam dies and there is no water again. So what is the reaction of the people? The book of Numbers, chapter 20, verses 2 through 5. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." So, as you could expect, the people are murmuring. They are complaining. What is God's reaction in this case? Let's read verses 6 through 8, same chapter. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before your eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." The same reaction again. God performs another miracle. He gives them water without a slightest reproach, without a slightest condemnation. Why? In the first case of murmuring, in the second case of murmuring, in the third case of murmuring 40 years later, we are talking about the basic need. You cannot survive more than 3 days without water, right? So after 3 days, body begins to deteriorate. Maximum a week. For some strong people, maybe 10 days, maybe 2 weeks at the most. So this is a necessity. And when people are crying out, when they complain, God just quietly satisfies their thirst. He is providing. That's murmuring about water in the book of Numbers. Nothing changed. What about food? Let's read the book of Numbers, chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the people of Israel set out by stages from the wilderness of Sinai. And the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. What's the location? The wilderness of Paran. What is the time? It says, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month. So how long have they eaten manna at this point? Based on the time given. For about 1 year, right? This happened at their second year, second month after they had left. So for 1 year, they ate one food, manna. Have you tried this? To eat something. Well, let's not talk about a year, for a month. Breakfast, dinner, supper, same food, same menu for 30 days. What would your reaction be? They have eaten manna for 1 year. And, without studying the passage and related passages, you could come to the conclusion that this was something very natural for them to complain about, right? But when we dig a little deeper, we find some additional information. First of all, what is manna? What was it in essence? Let's read from the same chapter, the book of Numbers, chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills, or beat it in mortars, and boiled it in pots, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. So we learn, first of all, that you could do different things with it. You could boil it, you could bake it, you could presumably fry it. Then I'm not even talking about some spices that you could add. This day it's an Indian food, this day it's an Asian food, this day is a Russian-Ukrainian food or whatever. Right? So there was some variety of the ways that you could prepare this food for you. But what was the taste, the basic taste that's described here? It says it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. Well, I need to tell you that there is no word baked in the original. It simply says cakes or flatbread with oil. Have you tried that? I remember once we were with a group of pastors from the Washington Conference on a so-called Reformation tour, which started in Rome. Then we proceed to some well-known places of the Reformation, Protestant Reformation in Europe. And when we were in Italy, and we would have, communal meals together. So typically what they would start serving us with, the appetizers were like this. Pieces of bread, typically like a thin ones, the ones that you could find maybe at Olive Garden, around here. And then different kinds of oil, different kinds of olive oil. So first of all, when they gave it to us for the first time, well, sitting like thinking, well, bread is it's food, but why oil? And we began looking around and we see people dipping bread in oil and savoring the taste. Apparently, it's tasty. I don't know. But just imagine, if you haven't tried, what would the taste be? Bread with oil. That's the taste of manna. But what is fascinating about the biblical description of manna is that there is a different passage talking about the taste, and it sounds quite different. That's the book of Exodus, chapter 16, verse 31. Exodus 16:31. Now, the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white. So the same description is given, right? As the one that we just read. But then it says, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So now imagine again. Dip your piece of bread in oil and taste it in your mind. Now dip your piece of bread in honey and taste it. Do you feel the same? Is it the same taste? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, what we have is the fact that in one place it tastes like bread with honey. In another place it tastes like bread with oil. And the conclusion is that it did taste differently depending on the occasion. Based on these observations, the old rabbis wrote the following. I'm quoting from the commentary written by Hertz. The Midrash says that the taste of manna changed depending on what the person wanted to make it, what the person wanted to make from it. You want a cheeseburger? You want a red beet, borscht? You want a pasta? What do you want? Of course, the Bible doesn't say that it changed its taste each time, but what the Bible does say that it did taste differently in different occasions. So, what we are finding as a result is the fact that it was not same boring food all the time. You could prepare it differently. It tasted differently on different occasions. So there was variety. But the most important thing is the following. The book of Psalms, chapter 78, verses 23 through 25. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. What's the nature of manna, according to this statement? It's the bread of the angels. In the original, literally, it says, as for example, Young's literal translation has it, food of the mighty. Food of the mighty that gave them strength. It's the bread of the angels. And the Bible says that they did not get sick while they were traveling. They did not have any diseases while they were traveling. So this nourishment, this manna, was in abundance. It varied in taste. There was a variety of ways you could cook it, so that everything in terms of food and nourishment that the people needed, God provided. And it is in that context of having plenty, of having a variety, and having the most nutritious product ever, the so-called superfood. In this context, they begin murmuring. They begin complaining. What is God's reaction at this time? The book of Numbers, chapter 1, verse 1. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. This time, the reaction was very different. It wasn't a necessity that they were wanting, they began doing something quite different. Literally, the passage that we just read, the book of Numbers 11:1, says, they told evil unto God's ears. They told evil unto God's ears. They also claimed that it was better for them in Egypt. The book of Numbers, chapter 11, verse 18 says, for it was better for us in Egypt. Just imagine. They were beaten, they were enslaved, forced into hard labor, and they were asking God for salvation, and He brought them out. He did save them. And now they say, it was better for us in Egypt. So they lie. Then in verse 20, Numbers 11:20, it says, you have rejected the Lord. When they are lying, when there is a whim, when there is a contempt for God, when they talk evil to the face of God, He reacts differently. He sends His punishment. So today's sermon is God's story to murmurings. There are three very important lessons that we could take away. First, life under God's leadership is not free from difficulties. God was the one who placed the children of Israel in those difficult circumstances to help them to find out something about themselves, how they would react. Secondly, when God saved them each time, when God provided them each time, they were able to grow in trusting Him more and more. So the difficulties that God allows into our lives, they help us grow spiritually, emotionally, to grow us as persons. Secondly, for those who follow God, He gives everything they need. He promises that our necessities will be taken care of. And we have a promise in the book of Isaiah, chapter 33, verses 15 and 16. I'll briefly read the ending of verse 16. It says, His bread will be given Him. His water will be sure. This is a promise. God is supplying all the basic needs that His people need. And we could count on that. And the last lesson today is that if, in spite of God's care, of His daily provision, if a person shows ingratitude, if a person whims, speaks lies, speaks evil to the face of God, if a person expresses contempt and rejection towards God, then there is a punishment. But as soon as the people confessed, if you read the story further, as soon as they asked forgiveness, God immediately stopped the punishment and accepted them and blessed them again. God's story to murmurings. This passage shows to us that we could be honest with God. If we don't like something, don't hold it in. You could freely speak in the presence of God. If you are dissatisfied, tell Him, maybe even in strong formulas and using strong language. He understands. And the Bible, God's message today, assures us that God is with us all the time, and any time that we need Him. And ask, He will provide. Amen.